Reflections from the Village of New Beginnings is an illustrated talk about the poetic structure and meaning of Psalm 91. Psalm 91. He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of Yahweh, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God, in whom I trust. Surely he will save you from the fowler's snare and from the deadly pestilence. He will cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you will find refuge. His faithfulness will be your shield and rampart. You will not fear the terror of night, nor the arrow that flies by day, nor the pestilence that stalks in the darkness, nor the plague that destroys at midday. 1,000 may fall at your side, 10,000 at your right hand, but it will not come near you. You will only observe with your eyes and see the punishment of the wicked. If you make the Most High your dwelling, even Yahweh, who is my refuge, then no harm will befall you, no disaster will come near your tent. For he will command his angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. They will lift you up in their hands so that you will not strike your foot against a stone. You will tread upon the lion and the cobra. You will trample the great lion and the serpent. Because he loves me, says Yahweh, I will rescue him. I will protect him, for he acknowledges my name. He will call upon me, and I will answer him. I will be with him in trouble. I will deliver him and honour him. With long life will I satisfy him and show him my salvation. I've been working to try to understand Psalm 91 for about 4 years, and I think I'm getting somewhere. As a result, I would like to introduce you to a new Bible hero, the author of Psalm 91. He writes about reflections from the Village of New Beginnings. I am calling him Jonam. The name does exist, but it is very uncommon. And this may well be the only psalm Jonam wrote. Now, Jonam was a farmer, as you might guess, a subsistence farmer who wrote about the life he lived. This was in the days when older people's knowledge and wisdom was valued. And I'm using a name rather than calling him the psalmist, because it emphasises that the writer was a real person in a real world, though it was a very different world to ours, and the psalmist refers repeatedly to his personal situation. My research has included examining ancient Hebrew poetry, the Psalms, and also considering the relevant ancient history and the culture of the times in which they were written. I have had amazing opportunity to visit subsistence farmers in remote parts of Africa. I've lived in a grass hut and eaten local food. And then I've even had some help from the COVID pandemic. Now, when I was growing up, I never knew that there was poetry in the Bible, as we use the King James Version. And that was set in 17th century English, and it was a mass of words with very few breaks. But now I use the NIV, and in particular the 1984 edition. This highlights poetry because it sets it out in lines. And each line has 2 or more parts, with the second and subsequent parts inset. And that helps understanding of the poem's poetic structure. Notice I use Yahweh instead of Lord. Yahweh was the name God gave to Moses to use, but centuries later, Jewish people decided it was too holy to use, so they substituted Lord. That is why it is set out in such a curious way, using capitals with a mixture of font sizes. Let me show you a bit more of Hebrew poetry. Each line is set in 2 parts, and the Second part is inset. Coincidentally, in Psalm 91, the Hebrew poetic lines correspond to the English verses. And then each line or group of lines, we call that a strophe, promotes one idea. And that is part of the theme. So all the ideas contribute to that theme. I was working on this in the summer of 2020. I could not see what it was about. It seemed to jump around from one random comment to another. And I was particularly stuck on this phrase, in the shadow of the Almighty. Modern idiom uses the phrase, in the shadow of, as a negative image about being restricted in development or opportunity because of being close to a more powerful and more obviously gifted person who takes centre stage. But that didn't seem right as being an explanation for how it was used here. And then it's paralleled with in the shelter of the Most High. Now, what is that referring to? And what has that got to do with dwelling in or with Yahweh? Also, in 2020, I was repointing the patio. Do you remember how hot it was? We were in COVID lockdown. So I took the opportunity to do some work in the garden, week after week. It was hot work in the sun. From time to time, I needed to rest, so I looked around for shade. And one day, I had a light bulb moment. I thought, is this what Jonah was doing? I will rest in the shadow of the Almighty, he says. Could he be comparing his relationship with Yahweh, his God, to his experiences in life? And it would seem he was a farmer from the references that are here in this psalm. The penny dropped. Jonah was writing about life as he experienced it in the Middle East some 2,500 years ago. It's amazing to have details of his life, what it meant to him, and it is set out in stunning poetry. Jonah was working hard in his fields, so from time to time he needed temporary relief. He wanted shade to rest, perhaps to plan his next task, chat with a neighbour, greet his children. He needed shade from the sun and then shelter. Well, part of that shelter was from the rain or the wind or the cold even. And I think that experiencing this shade and shelter in the busyness of life reminded him that Yahweh provided something like that shade and shelter from the troubles of life. I reckon Jonah was getting on in years. He spent his life as a subsistence farmer. And after a life of hardship and trouble, he is in a place of peace and he reflects on his life. He sees analogies between his daily life and the relationship he has had with Yahweh. And I've examined Psalm 91 from this perspective and have found it rings true. This was the sort of country in which Jonah lived. There was good agricultural land, set in open countryside. The forest and the hills were there, where he could forage and hunt. Jonah lived many years ago, but the principles of subsistence farming persist. And this photograph is modern day, well, 2007 actually, of subsistence farming in South Sudan in Africa. Peter, my friend pictured here, lived off his own land. And by that I mean he and his family survived on what they grew and bred. And it still happens throughout Africa and in many other parts of the so-called undeveloped world. And it's a tough life, dawn to dusk, day after day. Farming, hunting, carrying water from a well or stream, And the family might well even make their own clothes from animal skins or wool from sheep and goats. Certainly in ancient times that would be the case. And then meals, they had to be prepared from scratch every time. No fridges, no freezers, perhaps no way of keeping food fresh from day to day in the heat of the tropics or subtropics. It's custom then not to have any breakfast because you need to prepare your food. So you get up at dawn, 6 o'clock, and you start work straight away. And as well as work in the field, a major task was preparing meals from scratch day after day. That could take a few hours. So the first meal of the day would be around about 11 or 12 in the heat of the day. Sunset came about 6 and there was no twilight. It could be almost pitch dark in 30 minutes. So a second meal would be taken, if food was available, in the late afternoon. Meals would be very basic. Bread in the Middle East and Africa and rice in Asia with some vegetables and fruit or meat from a captured wild goat, deer or other animal, or perhaps a homebred goat or chicken. And it's like that today. And Peter and Joyce Bacota, they lived there with their children, even with the wider family as well, and they were able to sustain themselves on their land. Features of rural life in tropical and subtropical climates that are relevant to Psalm 91 and Jonah's life was this idea of meeting in the cool of the day. The day starts at dawn, work goes on in daylight hours, but in the late afternoon, as it cools down, work ends, and there is 2 to 3 hours for eating, talking and sharing. And here, for example, are Bedouins, Arabs, in the desert. And you see the long shadows, indicative of being a late afternoon. An African family doing the same. A group of friends at the end of a training day, chatting together and relaxing. Jonah and his family would follow this pattern. Furthermore, this would be the time for their family time and community time. We know that they were religious, they had a religious life, and it was well established. We read about it in the Old Testament, and some Psalms have interesting insights into how this faith worked out in practice. Notice this psalm here, it says, "Hear my teaching, listen to the words of my mouth." We will not hide them from their children, we will tell the next generation. And this was commanded in the law. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. And this, I think, is where Psalm 91 fitted in the ancient times. It was a teaching psalm. Jonah writes about his personal testimony of Yahweh. And here in Psalm 91, we hear the voice and the heart of a godly man who lived to please and serve Yahweh and taught others to follow his example. And Psalm 91 is what he wrote. What was this idea? Dwelling in Yahweh. The rest of the psalm explains what he meant, but I'll tell you now. It's all about putting Yahweh first. Trusting Yahweh through all the problems and troubles that are inevitable in all our lives, then and now. And it is set in the lifestyle that he lived. And that's why we need to know something of this lifestyle so we can properly appreciate what he is talking about. So then he talks about refuge and fortress. What is that about? Well, it's not about our version of a fortress. That tends to be about an isolated castle for the protection of a local lord, his family, entourage and soldiers. But what about the local people, the villagers, the field workers? They were not often considered in Europe and UK ancient fortresses that we still have in our countryside. To Jonah, a fortress was a walled city. Though he's written this as a personal experience, Jonah was part of a wider community. Apart from his own family and the local village, nearby would be in a township, community headquarters. And some of these developed into walled cities, and they were fortresses as well for the scattered communities around. And this here is a reconstruction of the city of Lachish that archaeologists have excavated. It's an example of what the Bible refers to. And in times of trouble, this is where everyone gathered. And Jonah sensed that Yahweh was something like that in comparative troubles, whether they were spiritual, emotional, or in the practicalities of life. Now, we've had the images of shadow and shelter for the minor stresses of life, of everyday life, but here is an illustration of how Yahweh is also available for the catastrophic crises that we all experience from time to time. So this here is the theme of the psalm, Yahweh, my dwelling. And the psalm is all about how he lived out that experience in everyday life. Halfway through the psalm, it refers again to dwelling in Yahweh, the Most High God. The same message is basically repeated from verse 1. And this suggests the psalm is in two parts. There's stanza 1, verses 1 to 8, and then stanza 2, there's verses 9 to 16. Stanza 1 is about his own commitment. Yahweh is my dwelling. I will say of Yahweh, you are my dwelling. Stanza 2 is introduced with, if you make the Most High your dwelling. Stanza 2 is addressed to his listeners, his family, his community, and to us too. Follow my example, he says. You too need to put Yahweh first in your life. The scene is set in the first strophe, the group of lines with a single idea that sets the theme of the psalm, the psalmist's experience. Now, notice I refer to this as strophe X, as it presents the core theme of the psalm. Stanza 1 then has 3 more strophes, A, B and C, and these illustrate 3 ways of dwelling in Yahweh, how Yahweh affected his life. And they feature in A, it's about protection, B is about rescue, and C is about preservation. A is about protection. Surely he will save you from the fowler's snare. Now, what was that? Well, a fowler caught birds. That's a tasty meal. And there were plenty to catch. As the country of Israel was at a key geographical place between Africa in the south and Europe and Asia in the north, and migratory route of birds went through Israel. And from time to time there could be thousands of birds coming through. So a fowler might even use a net to capture them. This was a beautiful, amazing way of having a luscious meal and even a feast. But in spite of that need, in spite of what could be a desperate need, that's not what the psalmist is talking about. He is talking about the bird being saved from the fowler's snare. That's amazing, isn't it? I find that aesthetically a beautiful image of protection that he thinks of even in the hard work and the hurly-burly of just surviving day by day. And then he talks about, you will not fear the terror of night, nor the arrow that flies by day, the pestilence and the plague. Imagine pestilence in the dark of the night, and it was dark, pitch dark. The only light might be almost not more than a birthday candle. And imagine someone's ill. How do you look after them? What's actually happening? Imagine there's a baby, a crying baby there in the dark of the night, and you touch the baby. He's so hot. What's wrong? And then you hear noises and smells, and oh, what do we do? How do we look after him? Diarrhea, vomiting, and what happens if he suddenly goes quiet? Has the baby died? Parents would be praying for daylight. How do you cope in a situation like this? The psalm doesn't go into details. It's poetry, so it hints and nudges. Our feelings are stirred, our imaginations are stirred, and that's the power of poetry at work. It speaks into our inner being, our mind, our thoughts, our emotions. And in the daytime there was danger also. Arrows could suddenly fly by. It could be out in the country when another hunter's arrow grows astray, or maybe brigands passing by, or armies scavenging for food, or out to rob and harm. In such situations, rescue was needed. And Yahweh was there. Preservation. What's this image? 1,000 may fall at your side, 10,000 at your right hand. Only one left standing? That seems selfish, doesn't it? But what's Yahweh talking about? How does it relate to him? Now, they knew what it was like to have marauding armies in the vicinity. People did that, so they knew what it was like to see an army come through. So the image here is, and it's created in our mind as much as what it says in the words, it's of a large army and a second even larger army arrayed in battle order. And in the destruction of a murderous battle, all but one soldier is killed or is so badly injured they can no longer fight. But this is not a fallen enemy, but companions and fellow soldiers are put out of action. That seems to be what it says, but that's not true to Yahweh's character. So the psalmist got something else that he wants to teach us. Notice that the psalm is set in the singular. It's about the relation between Yahweh and Jonah, or me. Oh, and you too. But actually, it's about Yahweh's relationship with everybody who seeks to dwell in Yahweh and put Yahweh first in their lives. Because you see, Yahweh addresses us all personally. Yahweh can relate to everyone in the same way at the same time, because he's Yahweh. He can have that same intimate and devoted relationship with each of us, all at the same time. Stanzas 2, as it happens in the Hebrew poetry, follows the pattern of stanza 1. But this time he describes his personal testimony as encouragement to follow his example. Now, we don't have time to go into detail, but just a few brief comments. He speaks of Yahweh's protection on a difficult journey. He talks about rescue from powerful wild animals that was a real danger in the wild and open countryside. And then there was preservation, so they could enjoy a long and fruitful life. Yahweh was there with him in all these circumstances. The psalm is chock full of metaphors, word pictures. And although the Bible was written for us, it was not written to us. So we have to do some work to see what the psalm meant to the original writer and his first community. And we have some difficulty, we in the Western world, understanding it, but I think many Christians in the undeveloped world will not have the same problem. And though this was written hundreds of years ago, Jonah's message still speaks to us. And the question is, are we willing to follow his example? Now, we live in a totally different world to Jonah, and yet we too have the same things happen to us. Crises happen to us too. And when crises happen, we go on a journey. This is the journey of grief. But it's a journey that has an ending. And in God's grace, it is a journey that goes toward recovery and healing. And as we go on this journey, we first of all come into the village of denial and anger. This is where we look back at what we've lost, and we are destroyed. We feel lost. We feel anger, and we're full of regret and remorse and disappointment. But time moves on, and we progress along this journey, and we eventually come to another village, the village of no hope. In this village, we accept what we've lost. We no longer look back, but we get focused on our current state. And here we can feel full of despair, hopelessness, depression. We don't know what to do. We can't manage without our loss, and we do not see a way forward. But in God's grace, the journey continues. And we do begin gradually to see light at the end of the tunnel as we come to the village of new beginnings, where our focus is to start to look forward and to live again. Now, it's not that we forget everything that's happened, the loss. It gets integrated into our lives. So we may be changed. We may have a new direction, but life begins again, and we face new opportunities. And here in the village of new beginnings was where Jonah was when he wrote his poem, Psalm 91. His overall message was that life was much more sure and safe when Yahweh was at the centre. This is a message from Jonah in Psalm 91 that is for us too as we live through our crises and the troubles of life. It's a message that is repeated throughout the Bible. We may think of it as living for Jesus in the New Testament, but it is a theme that flows throughout the Bible, living by faith in Yahweh, the Almighty, the Most High God. For Jonah's God is our God too. Studying the Psalms in the light of what we know of the culture and lifestyle of the times enables it to come alive and become more relevant to us today. So further details about Psalm 91 and other Psalms too can be found in the Psalm Insights website.